The forest was gone before I heard the sound. 1 second it was there, pine, birch, early morning fog sitting low between the trunks the way it always did at 6 in the morning. The next second the tree line simply stopped existing, replaced by something vast and dark and geometric that had decided to be there instead. I was 3 kilometers into my run. I had one earbud in. I was thinking about a beetle. That is how first contact found me, sweaty, mid-stride, scientifically distracted. The ship did not descend. That is the wrong word for what it did. It displaced. One moment the sky above the northern perimeter of the research base was empty. The next moment it was not, and the air pressure dropped so fast that my ears popped and I staggered sideways into a tree that was still, fortunately, a tree. I pressed my back against it and looked up. The underside of the hull was the color of deep water and covered in a geometric pattern that I could not stop looking at even though everything else in my brain was screaming. Equilateral subdivisions, fractal repetition, structural load distribution rendered as decoration, or decoration made structural. I could not tell which, and that fact lodged in my mind like a splinter. Not the time, Nadia. The base alarm started, 3 short bursts, then nothing, then silence, which was worse. I was Nadia Voss. I was 28 years old. I had a doctorate in xenobiology and a field certification that my supervisor said I had earned the hard way, which was his polite way of nodding that I had earned it by doing things that were not technically in the protocol. I had grown up in a part of Ohio where the steel mill had closed 6 years before I was born, and the town had been quietly pretending it had not happened ever since. That place had given me 2 things: the ability to make something functional out of whatever was available, and a very clear understanding of what it looked like when something powerful had already decided you did not matter. I was currently receiving that look from an alien warship. The ground forces deployed in under 4 minutes. I counted. I was crouched behind a supply crate near the eastern equipment shed, and I watched them come down the ramp in 2 parallel columns, and I watched the columns split at the base of the ramp into 4 directions with a precision that was not trained so much as architectural. They were not following orders in that moment. They were executing a geometry. They were tall, broader at the shoulder than a human, but with a narrowness at the hip that made them look like they had been designed for speed and then armored as a secondary thought. Their suits were the same deep-water color as the hull. Their helmets were closed. I could not see faces. What I could see was the equipment they carried, and I spent approximately 40 seconds cataloging it the way I always cataloged things, which my 3 most recent supervisors had each described as professionally alarming. The weapons were long-barreled, single-point grip. The casing on each one was engraved with the same geometric subdivision pattern I had seen on the hull, which meant either the pattern was purely aesthetic, which seemed unlikely for a military force, or it was a marking system, which meant rank or unit designation, or it was ceremonial, which meant. And this was the thing that hooked me, which meant this was a formal occasion. They had dressed up for this. I filed that away and looked for the one in charge. He was easy to find, not because he was larger, though he was, not because his weapon was different, though it was. It was the way the soldiers moved in relationship to him, the way every person within 40 meters unconsciously angled their body toward him without looking at him directly, the way you angle toward a heat source without deciding to. He walked to the center of the base yard. He looked at the communication tower. He said one word. I did not understand it. One of the soldiers raised a device and the tower went dark, not exploded, not damaged, simply powered down to nothing in the space of half a second. Then he looked around the yard. I was the only human still standing in the open. This was not bravery. I want to be very clear about that. There had been a window, approximately 90 seconds earlier, when I could have run with the others toward the shelter bunkers on the south end of the base. I had missed it. I had been looking at a beetle on the underside of the supply crate. A beetle I had not catalogued before, black-shelled, with a marking on its carapace that looked almost like a letter. And by the time I looked up, the window was closed and the soldiers were between me and every route south. So I was standing there, in my running clothes, one earbud still in, staring at the commander of an alien invasion force from behind a supply crate that I was now realizing offered exactly no tactical protection. He saw me. The moment he saw me, everything in his body language shifted. Not much. Not the way a human shifts, but something in the angle of his helmet changed, and the soldiers nearest him picked it up and turned. And just like that, every weapon in my immediate area was pointed at me. I stepped out from behind the crate. I am still not entirely sure why I did that. My working theory is that the cover was useless anyway, and something in me decided that if this was the end, I was not going to spend it crouching. I had spent too much of my life crouching. I was tired of it. He walked toward me. The soldiers moved with him, maintaining spacing, maintaining that perfect geometry. He stopped 6 meters away. He raised his weapon. The casing caught the morning light. I looked at the geometric engraving and I thought, the lines in the second subdivision are decorative. The load-bearing structure is in the outer frame only. This weapon is dress uniform. This is a ceremony. He was looking at me, the way things look at other things they have already finished thinking about. I knew that look. I had known it since I was 9 years old, standing on the porch of a house in Youngstown watching something arrive that had already decided how the day would end. I had learned 2 things that day: that the decision was not always final, and that the only thing that had ever changed any decision that size was a single unexpected input that the deciding thing had not planned for. He had not planned for me. I opened my mouth. I asked him a question. The question was not what I had planned to say. I had not planned to say anything. My mouth had simply made a unilateral decision to operate, and my brain was following behind it at a distance, doing its best. He did not fire. This was the first interesting data point. He stood there, weapon level, posture settled into what I was already reading as a terminal stance, the kind of stillness that comes after decision rather than before it, and he did not fire. The 4 seconds passed that I would later learn was the standard execution window in hegemony compliance protocol. Then 5. Then 6. I kept talking. This was not courage. Let me be honest about that too. Courage is when you are afraid and you do it anyway. I was past afraid. I had gone through afraid and come out the other side into a state of clarity that I later described to my debrief panel as the part of your brain that takes over when the emotional systems accept that they are not qualified for the current situation. What I was doing was observing, out loud, the way I always observed. The running commentary that my field partner Graham had once said was like living inside a nature documentary, which he had meant as a criticism, and I had taken as a compliment. The engraving on your weapon casing, I said. The geometric subdivision pattern. It matches the hull of your ship. It matches your soldiers' suits. But the load-bearing structure is only in the outer frame, the rest is decorative, which means this isn't a field weapon. It's a ceremonial one, which means this is a formal event for you. You dressed for this. His helmet turned approximately 3 degrees to the left. I filed that. Your soldiers are operating in a pattern I've been watching for the last 4 minutes, I said. The split column deployment, the perimeter coverage ratios. It's too clean for improvisation. You've done this before, many times. This is a process you have run so many times that it has stopped requiring thought. The weapon did not lower, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. A very small change. The difference between the stillness of something waiting to act and the stillness of something that has become, momentarily, occupied. His second-in-command was standing 6 meters to his right. I had already catalogued the second-in-command, shorter, lighter build. The helmet angled with a constant slight forward tilt that I was reading as watchful rather than aggressive. He gave the commander a look. I could not see faces, but I could read the body. The look said, "Do it." Standard look. The look of someone for whom the current situation has a correct and obvious answer and they would like to proceed to it. The commander did not respond to the look. I kept talking. "I'm a xenobiologist," I said. "My entire field is built on first contact theory. I've spent 6 years studying what happens when two species encounter each other with no shared language and no shared context. You know what the single most important variable is? Not weaponry, not size, not numbers. It's which species asks the first question. The one that asks first is the one that's still trying to understand the situation. The one that doesn't ask, that one has already decided." His helmet moved again, a full 5 degrees this time. "You haven't asked me anything," I said. "Not one thing. You landed, you deployed, you aimed. You've already decided, which means you are operating on assumptions, and your assumptions were built from every other species you have done this to. And I am not them. So your assumptions are wrong. And if your assumptions are wrong, then your decision is wrong. And I think you know that because you're still standing here." He lowered the weapon. 1 centimeter. He did not know he did it. I was certain of that. It was a motor response, not a choice, the body registering a cognitive disruption before the mind had caught up to it. The soldiers nearest him did not react, which told me they had not noticed, which told me the movement was small enough to be below their threshold of attention. It was not below mine. I had 1 shot. I knew that. Whatever window had cracked open in the last 90 seconds, it was not a wide window, and the second in command was still standing there with his weight forward and his body language reading like a drawn breath. I asked the question I had been building toward from the first word. Did your civilization develop the concept of mercy before or after you built the weapon in your hand? Because that actually changes everything about what happens next. The silence after it was a different kind of silence than the one before. Before, the silence had been the silence of a situation with a known outcome waiting for its execution. A procedural silence. The silence of a filing system that had already sorted you into a folder and was simply processing paperwork. After the question, the silence was the silence of something that had encountered a file it did not have a folder for. He stood there. The second in command made a small movement. Not the nod this time, something sharper. A movement that said they were past nods and he should simply act. The commander held up one hand. The second in command went still. The weapon was still pointed at me. The 1 centimeter had not become 2, but the hand held out to his side, palm flat toward his second in command. That hand was doing something that the weapon was not. The weapon was a closed system. It had one function and one direction. The hand was a choice. I looked at him and I thought, you don't know the answer. You were never asked. Not by any of them, not once. And now you're standing here with a weapon you have used so many times that it has stopped requiring thought, and someone has asked you a question that requires thought, and you are discovering that you don't have the answer ready because no one ever needed you to have it. I did not say that out loud. Some things you do not say out loud. Some things you let sit in the air between two people and do their work in silence. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something to his soldiers. I did not understand the words, but I understood the tone, the specific register of a command being issued to people who had expected a different command, and I understood the result. They did not fire. 2 of them walked toward me. I let them come. I kept my hands visible, my posture open. I cataloged everything, the texture of their gloves, the faint sound their suits made when they moved, the way they communicated with each other through small head movements rather than words. As they walked me toward the ship's ramp, I looked back once. The commander was still standing in the center of the base yard. He was looking at his weapon. He had the look of someone who who had just discovered that a thing they had been carrying for a very long time was heavier than they thought. I filed that too. The ramp closed behind me and I went up into the dark of the ship and I thought, you are classified as a biological sample right now. You are not a prisoner. You are not an enemy. You are an anomaly in a system that has never processed an anomaly before. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. They put me in a room that was clearly not designed to hold a person. It was too large for a cell and too small for a habitat, with walls made of that same deep-water material as the hull and a floor that was slightly warm underfoot, and a ceiling that emitted a soft, directionless light like an overcast sky. There was nothing in it. No furniture. No fixtures. No indication that whoever designed the room had ever seriously considered that something alive might need to be inside it for any length of time. I sat down on the floor, took out my second earbud and started cataloging. The room was approximately 8 meters by 6. The door had no visible seam when closed, but the pressure differential when it opened was just barely detectable. The light varied in a 22-minute cycle. I timed it on my watch, brightening and dimming in a pattern that suggested it was not decorative but functional, possibly tied to some biological rhythm of the species that built the ship, some internal clock written into the architecture. I was sitting inside someone else's sense of normal. That was remarkable. I wrote it down in the small notebook I kept in the back of my running leggings because I was the kind of person who kept a notebook in her running leggings, and my supervisor Graham had stopped commenting on it 2 years ago. On the first page I wrote, "Mercy question, no answer available, filed for processing." On the second page I wrote, "Weapon casing, ceremonial, check against philosophical cultural significance." On the third page I wrote, "They have not fed me. Unknown whether this is oversight or irrelevance or they do not know what I eat, possibly all three." The door opened at what I estimated was 4 hours after they had put me in the room. The commander walked in alone. I stood up, not out of deference. It is simply easier to read a situation when you are standing. He was taller inside the room than he had seemed in the open yard. The scale was different without the sky above him. He had removed the ceremonial weapon and replaced it with a shorter sidearm that sat at his hip with the easy familiarity of a thing that had been worn long enough to become part of the body's map of itself. His helmet was still on. I could not see his face. He stood in the center of the room, and he looked at me for a moment, and then he said something in his language. "I don't speak that," I said. "You know that." He said something else, a different cadence, shorter, more deliberate, a question rather than a statement. I recognized the cadence of a question even without the words, the rising pressure at the end of the phrase, the slight pause after it, held open like a space that expected filling. "I don't know what you're asking," I said, "but you are asking, that's new." He crossed to the far side of the room and pressed something on the wall I had cataloged as a flat panel. A screen emerged, not a screen in any sense I recognized, but a surface that displayed information in a format that was clearly language, dense rows of the geometric subdivision characters I had been looking at since he aimed the weapon at me. He pointed at the screen. I walked over and looked. The characters were organized in columns. Each column had a header. Under each header were rows of the same character repeated with small variations, a record, possibly a list. I looked at the structure rather than the content. "This is a database," I said, "categorical, hierarchical. Whatever's in the rows is a subset of whatever's in the column header." He pointed at one column header. I looked at it. The character was one I had seen on the hull, on the weapon casing, on the suits. It appeared more frequently than any other single character in the visible portion of the text. It was not decoration. It was a root. "That character means something foundational," I said. "It's a root concept, something your whole system is organized under." He looked at me. Then he pointed at himself. Your rank, I said, or your function, or both in your system, maybe they're the same thing. He pointed at me. I pointed at myself. Nadia, I said. He repeated the sounds, not perfectly but recognizably. Nadia. Yes, I pointed at him and waited. Veth Carol, he said, and his voice in his own name had a quality it had not had when speaking any other sounds, a slight deepening, a weight on the second syllable. Veth Carol, I said. He nodded once, a small movement, but I was watching for small movements. I had been watching for small movements since the moment he raised the weapon and did not fire. We built a language in the next 6 hours. Not a real one, a working one, a scaffold of pointed fingers, repeated sounds, drawn shapes. He had a stylus that wrote on any surface and he drew shapes, and I matched them to things I could see or concepts I could demonstrate, and he cataloged them in the small device on his forearm with the focused precision of someone who had never done this before but was very good at doing things for the first time. By the end of the 6 hours, I knew approximately 40 of his words. He knew approximately 40 of mine. On the morning of the second day, he asked his first real question. It was halting, pieces of his language and pieces of mine stitched together with gestures, but I understood it. He was asking about human military capacity, numbers, weapons, strategic positioning. I answered every question completely and accurately. He stopped writing, he looked at me. I shrugged. I'm a scientist, not a soldier. You can look all of that up. You probably already know most of it. And I need you to understand that I am not afraid of you knowing it, which is more useful to both of us than me pretending to be brave. He wrote that down. Then he asked another question, same format, direct, categorical. I answered it, then I asked him one back. He answered. He did not mean to. I could see the moment he recognized that he had answered, the slight pause in the rhythm of the session, the 2-second recalibration. He kept writing anyway. This happened 3 times before the pattern became visible to him. On the third instance, he stopped and looked at me in the specific way of someone who has just realized they have been participating in something they did not agree to participate in. I met his gaze. That's called a conversation, I said. It goes both ways. It's how my species processes information. We can stop if you want. But you have learned more about me in the last 4 hours by answering my questions than I have learned about you by answering yours, and I think you know that. He sat with that for a moment. He did not stop. What I learned over the course of those 48 hours, in the broken working language we were building in real time, the hegemony had expanded through 42 star systems. In each system they had deployed what he called, when I pressed him for the root concept, the compliance process. The process had never required a second deployment. Not once. Every species in every system had complied after the first contact event. I was the first anomaly the process had ever generated. I did not show what that did to me. I wrote it in the notebook later in the dark of the 22-minute light cycle when the room was at its dimmest. I wrote 42. None of them asked why. What he learned about me, I was not military. I was not command. I was not, in any framework his system had for evaluating humans, a significant asset or a significant threat. I was a scientist who had been running a kilometers-long loop and encountered an invasion by accident. This confused him more than anything else I told him. On the second evening he asked me, slowly, carefully, with the working language, why I had stayed in the open yard, why I had not run with the others. I told him about the beetle, about the marking on its carapace that looked like a letter. He sat very still. You were studying an insect, he said, or the approximation of it in our working language. I was studying an insect, I confirmed. While we deployed. While you deployed. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something in his own language that the working vocabulary did not cover, and he did not try to translate it. I did not ask him to. Some things translate better in silence. That night I lay on the floor of the room. The floor was warm enough to sleep on, a detail that I catalogued in the notebook. And I looked at the ceiling cycling through its 22-minute rhythm, and I thought about 42 species. I thought about them in sequence, one after the other, and I tried to imagine each one in the moment of first contact, the weapon raised, the process unfolding. I tried to imagine any of them asking why. I could not find an answer for why none of them had. I could only find an answer for why I did. I came from a town where something powerful had arrived and decided everything without asking anyone anything. And the thing I had learned from that, the thing I had carried out of Youngstown and through a doctorate and into a field certification and into this room on an alien warship, was that the decision was not always the end of the conversation. Sometimes, if you spoke first, the conversation was just beginning. I slept deeply, without apparent fear. I did not know until much later that Veth Carroll watched this on the monitor outside my room for 11 minutes before he realized he was doing it, and that when he finally walked away, he went to the database on his ship and searched for the answer to the question I had asked him in the yard. Did your civilization develop the concept of mercy before or after you built the weapon? He searched for 6 minutes. He found the answer. The weapon came first, by 600 years. He stood in the corridor of his own ship in the dark and held that information and did not tell anyone and did not write it down and did not know, yet, what to do with it. He went back to his station. He did not sleep. On the morning of the third day, I woke up with a plan. This was not unusual. I often woke up with plans. Graham had once said that the most alarming thing about me was not what I did but the speed at which I moved from observation to action, as if for me the two things were a single motion with no pause between them. He had meant it as a warning. I had taken it as a description. I had been in the room for 2 days. I had built a working language of roughly 200 shared concepts. I had mapped the light cycle, the pressure differential at the door, the faint vibration in the floor that told me the ship's engine was running at low power holding position, not moving. I had noted the patrol rotation outside my door, 3 different sets of footsteps, cycling on a 90-minute interval, the middle shift always slightly slower than the other 2. And I had been thinking for 2 days about the orbital assessment. Veth Carroll had not told me about it directly. He had not needed to. I had pieced it together from the questions he asked, the specific categories, the weighting toward infrastructure and population distribution and strategic positioning. Those were not questions you asked to understand a species. Those were questions you asked to complete a file. The file had a deadline. I estimated 72 hours from first contact. I was 48 hours in. I had a 24-hour window. I sat up and looked at the door and thought about what I needed. The plan had 3 parts. The first was the simplest and the most dependent on a system failing to anticipate me, which, given everything I had seen so far, seemed like a reasonable bet. I pressed the flat panel beside the door, not the door control. I had identified that in the first hour, but a different panel, the one whose function I had not been able to determine from observation alone. The panel opened. Behind it were 4 shelves. 2 were empty. One held a row of containers that looked like sealed sample vials, the kind used in field biology for specimen collection. The other held a row of tools I did not recognize. I stood very still and processed what I was looking at. This was a specimen preparation station. They had put me in a specimen room, not a cell. A specimen room, which meant the classification of biological sample was not administrative language. It was literal, and which meant that someone on this ship had, at some point, identified this room's function in my presence and not considered it relevant information to withhold. Because they did not think I would look. I looked. The sample vials were sealed with a mechanism I studied for 3 minutes before I understood it, a pressure lock, not a key lock. My thumb could not generate the right pressure. My thumb and 2 fingers together could, if I angled the force correctly. I opened one. Inside was a dense mesh of conductive material, wiring, but not wiring I recognized, thinner than anything in the human toolkit and wound in a configuration that suggested it was not just conducting electricity but organizing it. Signal organization, not transmission, organization. My hands went very still on the vial. I thought about the communication tower going dark, one word from Veth Carol, one device raised by a soldier, tower dark. Not destroyed, dark. The device had not disrupted the signal. It had organized it, pulled every frequency into a configuration that looked, from the outside, like silence. I was holding part of the mechanism. I put the vial back very carefully. I studied the tool shelf. I picked up each tool and held it and thought about its probable function, not guessing, reading. Shape indicates use. Weight distribution indicates force application. Material indicates what it is designed to interact with. By the time the slow-footed patrol passed my door on the 90-minute rotation, I had identified 3 tools that, combined with the conductive mesh from one sample vial and the earpiece from my single remaining earbud, could build something. Not a weapon. Better than a weapon. When Veth Carol arrived for the morning session, I was sitting on the floor with my notebook open, and nothing in my hands, and no expression on my face that was different from any other morning. He sat across from me and we ran the session. More language, more questions his than mine trading evenly now, a rhythm we had settled into that he had stopped visibly registering as unusual. I was careful that morning. I asked about systems and processes and how the ship's communication infrastructure was organized, and I asked it in the tone of genuine academic curiosity, which it was, alongside the other thing it also was. He answered. He told me about the relay structure, 7 nodes, central coordination through the bridge. The relay on Deck 4 was the primary transmitter for long-range signal, the one that would complete the orbital assessment file and transmit it to Hegemony Command. I asked which deck we were on. He said 3. I wrote something in my notebook that looked like a linguistic note. It was not. That night, during the dimming phase of the light cycle, I built the device. It took 4 hours. My hands shook twice, once from focus, once from the specific fear that is not about being caught but about being wrong, about having made an error in the logic somewhere that I would not discover until it was too late to matter. I worked through both instances and kept going. The device was small enough to fit inside the closed notebook. Its function was not to disable the relay on Deck 4. Its function was to do something more specific, to access the relay's archive and transmit its contents outward before the completion signal closed the file. Not a call for help, not an alarm. A file drop. I had thought about what to send for a long time. I had thought about sending human military data, a threat, an implication of consequence. I had rejected it, not because it was wrong but because it was the response a system expected. It was the reply to a closed question. I was going to send something the system had no file for. The Hegemony's own compliance process records, every assessment from every system, 42 contact events, 42 compliance files, 42 species reduced to categorical data in a database that I had been reading over Veth Carol's shoulder for 2 days while he thought I was studying the language. I was going to drop that file on every research satellite Earth had in range. Not as a weapon, as evidence, as a record that said, look what has been done, look what the pattern is, look at 42 and ask the question that none of them asked. I finished the device at what my watch told me was 3 in the morning. I lay down on the warm floor and I did not sleep. At hour 89 I moved. The slow patrol passed. I pressed the door panel from inside in the sequence I had identified, 3 specific pressure points, a combination that was clearly intended to be operated from outside, but that worked, with 2 hands and a particular angle from within as well. The door opened. I walked out. The corridor was empty, dim. The ship's lights on the sleeping cycle, a lower version of the dimming phase in my room. I turned left because left was the direction from which the slower patrol always came, which meant it was the direction with the longer gap after they passed. Deck 4 was 1 level up. The stairs were not stairs. They were a sloped ramp with grip texture that my running shoes handled better than I expected. I went up them quickly and quietly and emerged into a corridor that was slightly warmer than Deck 3, a detail I noted without stopping. The relay room was where it should be. The door was not locked, and this, I had wagered, was because it did not need to be. You do not lock doors that your system cannot imagine anyone accessing without authorization. I went inside. The relay was large. It dominated the center of the room, a column of the same deep-water material as the hull with interface panels running its full height and the geometric subdivision characters dense across every panel. I found the archive node in under 3 minutes. I located the input interface. I took the device from my notebook. And Vethkarel walked through the door. He was not on patrol. He was simply there, and his presence in the doorway had the quality of something that had been in motion for a while and had arrived at its intended point. He looked at me. He looked at the device in my hand. He looked at the relay panel. He raised his sidearm. It was not the ceremonial weapon. He said something in his language, not the working vocabulary, his own words, fast and direct, and the tone was not a question. I turned to face him fully. "I know what you're saying," I said, "and I need you to listen to me for 30 seconds before you decide." His weapon did not lower. "I am not transmitting anything that will hurt you," I said. "I am not sending coordinates. I am not calling for military response. I am sending your records, your own contact files from 42 systems. I'm sending them to our research networks, not our military, our scientists." He was very still. "You asked me why my species is different," I said. "I told you we ask questions, but that's only half of it. The other half is what we do with answers. We distribute them. We share them. We put them somewhere that other people can find them and ask more questions. That is the thing your process has never encountered because the 42 species before us never had time to do it." I held up the device so he could see it clearly. "I am not trying to defeat you," I said. "I am trying to create a record. I am trying to make sure that whatever happens next, the people who come after this moment on both sides have more information than the people standing in this room right now. That is what I do. That is what my species does. We make records." He looked at me. He looked at the device. He looked at the relay. "How many of those 42 civilizations asked you why before you completed the process?" I said. He said nothing. "How many of them in the moment right before looked at you and said, 'Wait, I want to understand this first'?" The sidearm was still raised. His hand was completely steady. "None," I said, not a question. "None," he said, "the working vocabulary, our shared word." "Then you have no data on what happens when one does," I said. "You don't know what this leads to. Your system doesn't have a result file for this scenario because this scenario has never occurred. You are not executing a process right now. You are making a decision. Those are 2 completely different things, and I need you to know that before you make it." The door opened behind him. His second-in-command, Usendal, came in with 2 soldiers. Usendal looked at me. He looked at the device. He looked at Vethkarel. He said something short and sharp. Vethkarel held up one hand. Flat palm out toward Usendal. "Not toward me." The soldiers stopped. Usendal went absolutely still. the stillness of a system encountering an input it does not have a response for. Then he said something longer, more urgent, the cadence of someone outlining a very simple logical structure to someone they believe has temporarily lost access to logic. Carroll did not respond. He was looking at me. The weapon was still raised. His hand was still steady. But the hand he had held out to Usendow, that hand was a door he had put between his second-in-command and this moment, and he was keeping it closed. And we both knew what that meant even though neither of us said it. I connected the device to the relay panel. He watched me do it. He did not lower the weapon. He did not fire. The relay hummed. The characters on the panel shifted. The file dropped out through the transmitter, out through the signal, out into the space between us and the nearest research satellite. 42 contact files now moving at the speed of light toward every scientist Earth had listening in the dark. I disconnected the device. I turned to face him. I put my hands at my sides, and I stood there and I waited. The decision was his. The weapon was still up. The soldiers were behind him. Usendow's body language was a drawn breath that had been held for 30 seconds and was running out of places to go. Carroll lowered the weapon. Not 1 centimeter this time. All the way. The fleet withdrew on the 4th day. Not all at once. One ship first, the smaller one I had glimpsed through the relay room's single narrow viewport, positioned at the edge of the atmosphere like a waiting word. Then 2 more. Then the main vessel itself, with its hull the color of deep water and its geometric patterns and its 22-minute light cycle and its warm floors, rose from the scorched north end of the base and moved upward through the cloud layer and kept going. I stood in the base yard and watched it go. The communication tower was already back online. Someone had figured out the frequency lock within 6 hours of the fleet's withdrawal, Graham, as it turned out, using a tool he had borrowed from my equipment bag without asking, which I would have found professionally alarming if I had not been standing in the relay room at the time putting a device together from a specimen vial and an earbud. He met me at the edge of the yard as the last ship cleared the upper atmosphere. "You look terrible," he said. "I slept on a floor for 2 days," I said. "Was it at least a warm floor?" "Surprisingly, yes." He handed me a cup of coffee. I drank it in 4 long swallows and handed the cup back and turned to look at the scorched ring where the main vessel had sat for 4 days. The soil was blackened in a perfect geometric shape, the same subdivision pattern, smaller, a landing footprint that had pressed itself into the earth like a signature. New growth was already visible at the inner edge, small green things pushing up through the char. I crouched down and looked at them. "The debrief starts in 20 minutes, Graham said. "I know. They're going to want tactical analysis." "I know that too. Are you going to give it to them?" I looked at the small green things. One of them had a leaf with a marking on it that looked almost, not quite, like a letter. I opened my notebook. "I'm going to give them something better," I said. The debrief panel was 7 people in a gray room with a water pitcher in the center of the table that nobody touched. They had the posture of people who had spent 4 days in a crisis mode and had now arrived at a meeting that needed to produce something they could classify and file and close. They asked me about weapons, about troop numbers, about the geometry of the deployment, which I answered because the deployment geometry was significant and I had 12 pages of notes on it. They asked me about vulnerability points in the fleet formation. I put my notebook on the table. "The vulnerability point," I said, "is not in the fleet, it is in the philosophical record." The general at the head of the table looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who had been hopping for a different kind of answer and was now recalibrating. I opened the notebook. Their mercy framework is in their historical texts. I found references to it across the working vocabulary I built during captivity. It predates their expansion period. It predates the compliance process. It is older than the weapon by 600 years. The weapon came later, and when it came, the Mercy framework went somewhere. Not lost. Archived. Archived, the general said. Filed away. Put somewhere that it would not interfere with the process. And no species they encountered in 42 contact events ever made them look for it again. The room was quiet. We made them look for it, I said. That is what happened in the 4 days you were watching from the ground. That is the tactical situation, not their weapons versus ours, not their numbers versus ours, their archived philosophy versus their active one, and the question of which one a species reaches for when something interrupts the process long enough to give them a choice. The general looked at me for a long moment. And did he reach for it? She said. The commander. I thought about a hand held out, palm flat, toward a second-in-command who had been holding a drawn breath for 30 seconds. Yes, I said. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. They had what they needed, not what they had wanted, not coordinates and tactical data and strategic assessments, but what they actually needed, which was a framework for understanding what had happened and what might happen next, and those two things are never the same meeting. I walked out into the parking area and sat on a low concrete barrier and took out my notebook and wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. Not the debrief material. The other things, the 22-minute light cycle, the weight in Veth Carroll's voice when he said his own name, the way the soldiers had moved in relationship to him like a compass finding north, the quality of the silence after the question in the yard. The question had been an experiment. Every question I asked was an experiment. You pose a question to see what the system does when it encounters something it was not designed for. The answer is secondary. The system's response to the question is the data. His system had not fired. That was the data. I closed the notebook and looked at the sky, which was ordinary and blue and crossed by a commercial flight headed west. Somewhere in the data I had dropped on the research satellites, 3 universities and 2 government science bodies, and one 17-year-old in Seoul who ran a xenoculture blog had already found the same thing. I did not know this yet. I would find out 3 weeks later, when my email inbox became something I would describe to Graham as a documentary about chaos. The 17-year-old found it first. Her name was Claire, and she had been tracking the signal anomalies during the contact event from her bedroom, and had managed to capture the leading edge of the file drop on a receiver she had built herself from parts she had ordered online over a period of 2 years. She read the 42 compliance files in one sitting, at 4 in the morning, with a cold cup of tea going cold on the desk beside her. Then she looked at the frequency of a specific character in the database, the root concept, the one I had identified on the hull and the weapon and the suits, and she found something in the distribution pattern that I had not seen, because I had been working in a live situation with a weapon pointed at me, and Claire was working in a quiet bedroom with unlimited time and a particular kind of focused attention that is rare and should be encouraged. The character appeared in the compliance process, files exactly 42 times. Once per system, always in the same field position in the record. And in the philosophical archive texts I had included in the file drop, the older material, the pre-expansion records, the same character appeared 612 times. Claire posted her analysis at 5 in the morning. By 9 it had reached the research community. By noon 3 separate translation teams were working on it simultaneously without coordinating, which resulted in 3 slightly different but essentially convergent interpretations of what the character meant. Not rank, not function, not a root concept in the bureaucratic sense. A name. A name for a value. The way a culture names something it considers foundational. The way you name a virtue that your whole system claims to be organized around. The name meant, approximately, depending on the translation team, the quality of restraint in the presence of the power to act otherwise. The concept existed, It was named. It had been named for thousands of years. It appeared once in every compliance process file, in the field reserved for what had been determined to be absent in the target species, and therefore irrelevant to the contact assessment. They had been looking for it in the species they encountered. They had not found it. They had not looked for it in themselves. I read Claire's analysis on my phone while sitting on the concrete barrier in the parking area, and I sat very still for a while. And I thought about a commander standing in a corridor in the dark, having found an answer to a question that had never been asked of him before, holding it alone. I thought about what it costs to carry something like that. I thought about the 42 species who had not asked, not because they could not. The Mercy framework was named. It was in the archive. It was 600 years older than the weapon. Any of them could have found it if they had been given the time, if someone had created the interruption, if someone had stood in an open yard in running clothes with their hands visible and said, "Wait." I thought about a hand held out, one hand palm flat. That had been enough. What came next was not simple, and it was not fast. The hegemony did not turn around and come back with apologies and diplomatic envoys. That is not how systems built over centuries change. They changed the way the charred soil at the edge of the landing site changed, slowly, from the inside out, with small green things pushing up through the damage before anyone had given them permission to grow. Veth Carroll filed a classification report. I learned about it 6 months later, through a channel I am not going to describe in detail, from a source I trusted completely. The report classified Earth under a category that had not been used in the 600 years of the compliance process. The classification had been in the system, the entire time, unused, filed somewhere in the same archive that held the philosophical texts and the named values and the 600-year-old Mercy framework. The classification meant approximately contact interrupted, reassessment required, standard process not applicable. His second-in-command, Usendow, filed a formal objection to the classification. This was, I was told, the first formal objection ever filed against a hegemony contact commander's assessment. It was logged. Veth Carroll acknowledged it. He did not change the classification. He did not explain himself. He did not yet have the vocabulary. He was looking for it. I know this because the file drop contained something I had not expected it to contain, a subroutine in the relay archive that I had not built and had not introduced, a small piece of code that my analysis team identified 8 months after the contact event as a return path signal, a way to send something back along the same route it had come. Someone had added it after I connected the device. After someone on that ship, in the window between the file drop and the fleet's withdrawal, had opened the relay archive and added a two-way function where I had only built a one-way one. I stared at the analysis report for a long time. I thought about what it meant to add a door. Not to use it yet, not to walk through it, just to put it there. To make the architecture include the possibility of return, to look at a one-way thing and decide quietly without announcement that it should have a way back. I called Graham. "The relay has a return path," I said. There was a pause. "What does that mean?" "It means someone on that ship is also making a record," I said. "It means this is a conversation. It has been a conversation since I asked the first question. We just didn't know the other side was answering." I hung up and sat in the quiet of my office. I had an office now, a new one, in a building that had been repurposed in the 2 months since contact to house a team that had not existed before the contact event, and I looked out the window at an ordinary afternoon. The charred ring at the base had greened over almost completely. The geometric impression in the soil was still visible from above, from the satellite imagery that Claire had helpfully emailed me at 2 in the morning the previous week with the subject line, "I found something else." She had. She always did. I opened my notebook to a new page. At the top I wrote the character that meant restraint in the presence of the power to act otherwise. I drew it carefully from memory. The geometric subdivision lines, the structure in the outer frame and the decoration filling the space within, the character that appeared once in 42 compliance files in the field reserved for what was absent. I had seen it on a weapon aimed at my face. I had seen it on a hand held flat against a corridor wall, stopping a second-in-command mid-motion. I had seen it in an archive that was 600 years older than the thing it had been filed away to make room for. I was looking at it now, in my own handwriting, in a notebook that had started the day of the contact event with a note about a beetle. Somewhere 42 light-years out, a commander was looking up the word they had archived. He had found it. He had not yet decided what to do with it. Neither had I. But we both had the return path now. And the conversation was still open. That was enough. That was, as it turned out, everything.